Fidel Alejandro Castro Reyes, born August 13, 1926, is a Cuban communist revolutionary and politician who served as Prime Minister of Cuba from 1959 to 1976 and President from 1976 to 2008. He led the 26th of July movement, which overthrew the U.S. backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Castro was born into a wealthy family in Holguin province, and was educated at the Jesuit schools in Santiago de Cuba and Havana. He began his political career in the early 1950s as a member of the Orthodox Party of Cuba, but quickly became disillusioned with the corruption and authoritarianism of the Cuban government. In 1953, he and a group of fellow rebels attempted to overthrow Batista in a failed attack on the Moncada barracks. Following this failure, Castro went into hiding and began organizing a guerrilla army to fight against the government. In 1956, he and his followers landed in eastern Cuba and began a guerrilla campaign against the government. After several years of fighting, the rebels were able to gain control of much of the country, and on January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country. Castro and his followers established a socialist government in Cuba, nationalizing much of the country's economy, including large landholdings, businesses, and industries. The new government also implemented a number of social programs, including universal healthcare and education, and made significant efforts to improve the living standards of the poor. However, the new government's policies were met with opposition from the United States, which had long-standing economic and political ties to Cuba. The U.S. government imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, and attempted to overthrow the Castro government through a series of covert operations, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. In 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a major standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The crisis was ultimately resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Castro's government continued to implement socialist policies, including the collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of the country's banks and industries. The government also made significant investments in education and healthcare, and Cuba became a leader in the region in these areas. In the 1980s and 1990s, Cuba's economy struggled due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been one of the country's main trading partners and sources of aid. The government introduced a number of economic reforms in an effort to revive the economy, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. In 2008, Castro stepped down as president due to health issues and was succeeded by his brother, Raúl Castro. Fidel Castro continued to play a role in the government as a member of the National Assembly and the Communist Party of Cuba. He died on November 25, 2016. Throughout his long political career, Fidel Castro was a controversial figure, admired by some for his efforts to improve the lives of the poor and bring about social justice, but criticized by others for his authoritarian policies and human rights abuses. Fidel Castro's government had a number of problems with the United States throughout his time in power. The U.S. government was opposed to the socialist policies implemented by Castro and his followers, which included the nationalization of large landholdings, businesses, and industries in Cuba. In 1960, the United States imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, which severely impacted the island's economy. The U.S. government also attempted to overthrow the Castro government through a number of covert operations, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, in which a group of CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempted to invade the island and overthrow the government. Additionally, the U.S. government supported a number of anti-Castro Cuban exiles and groups, who carried out a number of acts of sabotage and terrorism against the Cuban government and its citizens. In 1962, the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a major standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The crisis was ultimately resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The U.S. government also accused the Cuban government of supporting leftist rebel groups in Latin America and other regions, and of harboring fugitives and criminals. The U.S. embargo on Cuba remained in place throughout Fidel Castro's time in power and continues to be in place today. The U.S. government has also maintained a policy of isolating the island nation and has opposed efforts by other countries to improve relations with Cuba. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara had a close personal and political relationship. They first met in Mexico in 1955, where they were both exiled and involved in the Cuban revolutionary movement. They quickly formed a strong bond and Guevara joined Castro's 26th of July movement, which aimed to overthrow the U.S. Pact dictator Fulgencio Batista Cuba. In 1956, Castro, Guevara, and a group of other rebels sailed to Cuba aboard the Granma, and began a guerrilla campaign against the government. Guevara played a key role in the rebel army, serving as a military strategist and leading a number of successful engagements against the government forces. After the success of the revolution in 1959, Guevara served in a number of important government positions, including Minister of Industry and head of the National Bank of Cuba. He also played a key role in the implementation of socialist policies in the country, including the collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of the country's banks and industries. The two men were close both personally and politically. Guevara admired Fidel's leadership and strategic thinking. Fidel on the other hand relied on Guevara's operational planning and execution. In 1965, Guevara left Cuba to try and promote revolution in other countries, including the Congo and Bolivia, but was captured and executed in Bolivia in 1967. Fidel Castro was deeply affected by Guevara's death, and the two men remained close allies even after Guevara's death. Guevara's image and legacy continue to be an important symbol of the Cuban Revolution, and his ideas have been an inspiration for many leftist movements and individuals around the world. Castro was known for his charismatic speeches and strong rhetoric throughout his political career. He made many famous quotes that have become popular and widely recognized. Some of his most famous quotes include: "A revolution is not a bed of roses. A revolution is a struggle between the future and the past. I am not a communist because I think it is the only good system, but because for my country it is the best system. I find the capitalism repugnant. It is filthy, it is gross, it is alienating. Because it causes war, hypocrisy and competition. I have always been consistent. I have always fought for the same ideals and principles. A leader is not one who says follow me but one who says let's go. The greatest enemy of mankind is not imperialism, but poverty. I have always been consistent. I have always fought for the same ideals and principles. If you can't solve a problem, then it's because you've got the wrong problem." These quotes represent the ideologies and principles that Fidel Castro stood for during his long political career, which were centered around socialism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and social justice. Fidel Castro received a number of awards and prizes throughout his political career. Some of the most notable include the Lenin Peace Prize, 1963. This prize was awarded to Fidel Castro by the Soviet government in recognition of his role in the Cuban Revolution and his efforts to promote peace and solidarity among nations. The Order of José Martí, 1977. This is the highest civilian award in Cuba, which was awarded to Fidel Castro by the Cuban government in recognition of his contributions to the country and his role in the revolution. The Order of the National Hero, 1998. This is another highest civilian award in Cuba, which was awarded to Fidel Castro by the Cuban government in recognition of his contributions to the country and his role in the revolution. The Order of the Aztec Eagle, 2002. This is the highest award given to foreigners by the Mexican government, which was awarded to Fidel Castro in recognition of his contributions to the Latin American region and his role in the Cuban Revolution. The Order of the National Hero of Angola, 2005, this is the highest award given by Angola, which was awarded to Fidel Castro in recognition of his contributions to the struggle against colonialism in Angola and his support of the Angolan people. Fidel Castro also received many honorary doctorates and medals from various universities, organizations and countries throughout his life. It's worth mentioning that his political ideology and leadership style have been the subject of controversy, so some countries and organizations have criticized and rejected the awarding of such prizes to him. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90. His death was announced by his brother, Raúl Castro, on Cuban state television. The cause of death was not officially announced, but it was reported that he had been in poor health for several years before his death. Fidel Castro's death was met with a wide range of reactions, both in Cuba and around the world. In Cuba, a 9-day period of mourning was declared, and thousands of people gathered in Havana's Revolution Square to pay their respects. Many Cubans viewed Fidel Castro as a national hero and a symbol of the country's revolution, and his death was seen as a significant loss for the country. In the United States and other countries, reactions to Fidel Castro's death were more mixed. Some viewed him as a dictator and human rights violator, while others saw him as a revolutionary leader who had brought about significant social and economic changes for the Cuban people. Fidel Castro's funeral was held on December 4, 2016, in Santiago de Cuba, where his ashes were interred in the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery, next to the remains of José Martí, Cuba's national hero. After Fidel's death, his brother Raúl, who was the first vice president at the time, took over the presidential duties, and later on in 2018 Raúl Castro stepped down as president, making way for a new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel.